Marilynn Lawrence teaches philosophy outside of Philadelphia and works as a UX content strategist. She has a BA in psychology from Pennsylvania State University and an MA in philosophy from Westchester University. And then I'm going to skip the next 300 words just to say that she is published. She is an artist. She works in continental philosophy and aesthetics and is a huge fan of Neoplatonic studies, not just fan, a scholar of Neoplatonic studies, as well as a little thing called, what is it called? Deep pantheism, right? Ecstatic naturalism, deep
aesthetic
pantheism.
naturalism. Could be all
Yeah, which she first told me about when we met a couple of years ago at the it's a Pittsburgh Continental Networks conference on that's where we met, and it was really good. And she told me about lots of really cool stuff. And then we've met up a couple of times since then at other conferences, and also when I traveled across the country just a few months ago, where we got to hang out in Philly. So, without further ado, please welcome Marilynn Lawrence. Sorry. And then there's that thing I have to do where I just go like that. Okay. And
great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Carl Jung, here we go. One day last year, at work at my corporate job as a writer, I was asked a very startling question. What surprised me most was that the question was posed to me by an ambitious project manager who, while very intelligent, typically reads the type of books that people in his role read. Books about the latest trends in business thinking, thought leadership, agility, innovation, acceleration, along with the occasional book about practical Stoic exercises or mindfulness. The question was, what books by Carl Jung do you recommend? If I had my wits about me, I would have responded, Carl Jung. Now that's a name I have not heard in a long time. Instead, I recommended The Essential Jung and Man and His Symbols, the latter being one of the more accessible books that was popular in the 1970s and 80s. I soon realized that my coworker's sudden interest in Jung may have been caused by exposure to Jordan Peterson's reintroduction of him in the background of our instantaneous cultural vocabulary. Jung was something of an underground figure when I was an undergraduate student in psychology in the 90s. His overall popularity hadn't gained much traction beyond Joseph Campbell's hero myth adaptations or the superficial knowledge of his concepts of archetypes, the collective unconscious, and synchronicity. Because my psychology department was chaired by behaviorists and positivists who placed a high value on experimental scientific psychology, I found it notable that two of my professors revealed that they felt pressured to hide their interest in and practice of psychoanalysis, Freudian in this case. I personally gravitated toward theories and concepts related to the unconscious and spent a summer poring over Jung's collective works, enthralled, though not understanding a good portion of it at age 20. For a number of reasons, Jung has remained at the margins of academia, with some exceptions, such as the application of his theory to religious studies. For one, students who aim to become clinical or theoretical psychologists do not get introduced to Jung until very late in their graduate studies. The training, set up initially by the first generation of followers as the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, is very competitive, is often undertaken as a postdoctorate program, is very expensive, is very time-intensive, requiring 300 hours of analysis. Second reason is that anyone who wants the help of a professional psychoanalyst or psychotherapist or analytical psychologist, as Jungians call themselves, will find it to be a significantly pricey commitment, one only practically available to wealthy elite. A third reason, hinted at earlier, is that academic psychology has needed to maintain its scientific standing to receive funding and broad acceptance. Theories of the unconscious are often pushed into the junk drawer of universities, namely English and literature departments, where you can also rummage around to find continental philosophy, that is, unless you attend a school not on Brian Leiter's approval list. Fourthly, it is still intellectually safe these days to dismiss Jung based on his reputation for mysticism, a reputation he tried to combat in his lifetime, and his openness to religious symbolism and experiences. Or you can more seriously dismiss him based on his well-documented, though complicated, anti-Semitism. Even given these reasons for Jung's marginal status within academia, if Peterson is in fact responsible for the general public's renewed interest in Carl Jung, it's worthwhile to think about what such a trend might look like and to cut it off at the pass when it is attached to the political misalignments of Peterson and his base of supporters. To this end, I took a look at what contemporary Jungians actually believe in practice. If my hypothesis is correct, namely that Jordan Peterson has sparked a curiosity about Jungian psychology, this may be a symptom of an underlying trend that has contributed to Peterson's appeal. Academic intellectuals have not done a terrific job of marketing philosophy for life, particularly the theories and practices that we can heuristically tie to the puzzling imperative scribbled at Delphi, nothi se auton, know thyself. We live in a world where it's nearly impossible to escape bombardment of consumer-oriented identities, where even the value of being a unique individual, a geek or a nerd, if you will, is exploited into its own consumer-based subculture that is not so unique. The popularity of Peterson's self-help guidance points to a hunger for a deeper sense of identity, authenticity, and meaning. Criticisms of Peterson that simply ridicule him based solely on his use of Jungian concepts are superficial and ineffective. A more robust criticism would be concerning what he does with the concepts, as well as the outmoded camp of analysis he may fall into. And the presentation we just saw really goes into more depth in that area. For instance, it may be immediately obvious to Peterson's critics that his focus on the ancient virtue of Andrea, literally translated as manliness, is demographically limited, and his selective use of personal and collective mythologies and Jungian archetypes, he mentions Jung 182 times in Maps of Meaning, when combined with essentialism and biological determinism, conveniently fits into an androcentric, leucocentric worldview. This school of thought within psychoanalysis, broadly defined to include Jungian and Freudian, is generally not unique to Peterson, but is represented by a book called Relativism Under Fire, which was an odd, anti-feminist, anti-PC, anti-multiculturalist book from 1995 by Freudian psychoanalyst Robert Endelman. Endelman's worry was that cultural relativism in the service of feminism, gay activism, and multiculturalism, comparable to Peterson's postmodern neo-Marxism, undercuts the validity of what he called psychoanalytic universalism, the idea that there is a single human nature across time and cultures that can be revealed through the categories of psychoanalysis. Unsurprisingly, this socially conservative school of thought has not been the dominant one in contemporary psychoanalysis of our time of momentous social change and pluralistic values. In contrast to this reactive stance, and in contrast to Peterson's use of Jung that promotes particular mythologies, contemporary Jungian theorists, psychoanalysts, psychotherapists have taken Jung in a different direction by adapting and relating his theories to postmodern ideas about discourse, the self, and identity, and social and collective concerns. Some post-Jungians, as they call themselves, such as Christopher Hope, Sherry Salmon, and Paul Kugler, go so far as to say that Jung's understanding of the self and the unconscious are postmodern, or have contributed to ushering in postmodernity. It sounds counterintuitive for Jung to be postmodern. If anything, his esoteric and historical interests in alchemy and Gnosticism appear to be pre-modern. Yet many authors have made the case that while certain elements of Jung's body of work and personal views must be discarded, and others, such as archetypes of anima and animus, must be redefined, core Jungian ideas, the disintegrated self, the unconscious, archetypes and complexes, transference and countertransference, and the shadow, remain valuable and adaptable to today's personal, social, and political understandings. These contemporary developments were often made in awareness of the school of thought from which Peterson emerged, the extremist version of what post-Jungian Andrew Samuels designated as the classical school. For Samuels, this quote, "Fundamentalism exaggerates and exploits our undeniable need for order, pattern, meaning, and a presiding myth. Psychologies that express effervescent, shifting, anti-foundational, anti-essentialist, playful natures cannot find a place in the Jungian fundamentalist Weltanschauung. The fundamentalists, remaining pure, ignore everything else that is going on in psychotherapy and even in the worlds of ideas, politics, the arts, or religion." Before discussing some post-Jungian developments in analytical psychology, the meaning of postmodernism requires careful consideration to avoid the usual confusion over this multivalent and often misappropriated term. I don't limit postmodernism to Lyotard's definition, namely skepticism of metanarratives, nor to the academic postmodernism that informed a style of discourse that peaked in popularity in the 1990s, but more broadly recognize it as a confluence of changes that break with modernist assumptions and values, incipient in Nietzsche's critique of religion, science, and art. This beginning, along with Heidegger's concern about technology and the trajectory of calculated thinking, together with the observations by Lyotard, Foucault, Levinas, Baudrillard, Derrida, Irigaray, Jameson, Kristeva, Deleuze, and Guattari, Haraway, and many others, has spelled out the impossibility of returning to metanarratives, binary oppositions, and metaphysical essentialism about human nature. I find a description offered by Ian Thompson to be compatible with this understanding, while taking into account the transitioning to this sort of postmodernity is a continuing effort. He writes, "To be postmodern means to seek passage beyond modernity. In other words, postmodernity does not name a new historical epoch that is already here, a new age that came after modernity, as one trend might follow another, but rather the ongoing endeavor to get free of those modernist assumptions that have been most disastrous for our world and in the grip of which we remain so stubbornly caught." For Thompson, this involves a non-teleological Hegelian dialectic that transcends the, quote, "modern obsession with extending the human subject's dominance and control of an objective world," unquote, and twist freeze of our self-objectification as human resources to be optimized and made more efficient. This understanding draws out the ethical implications of the postmodern project along with its relationship to a critique of capitalism. Psychoanalytic theory and practice, insofar as it can be characterized as postmodern in the sense described above, would be sensitive to the pluralism of perspectives, would break free from fixed descriptions of the human being and the self, particularly the notion of the individual as a free subject, and would recognize within the personal and collective unconscious the modernist pain and shadows that result from violent mass exploitation of nature and persons, disregard for minorities, and inappropriate social and economic hierarchies. While there are many aspects of Jungian psychology that post-Jungians have grappled with and have adapted to this postmodern milieu, I will provide only a couple key examples here. I'll start with a Jungian understanding of the self that differs from the modern self as the individualistic self-willed ego. Jung starts from the position that the individual, the person if you will, is fragmented into different conflicting aspects of the self or even different selves. These parts of a self, for instance, feelings, drives, goals, behaviors, and preferences, can coalesce to become a self with a capital S that are not always, or even for the most part, conscious, but emerge, particularly in moments of crisis. The source of these churning and seemingly irreconcilable opposing forces is not confined within one's personal unconscious, but come from an underlying substructure shared by everyone that he called the collective unconscious. Jung describes the contents or materials of the personal unconscious as feeling tone complexes, and that of the collective as archetypes. Symbols and images become the access point to these complexes and archetypes. Concerning the historical influence on Jung's development of these ideas, Claire Douglas points to Kant, Schelling, Hegel, Goethe, Schiller, and Nietzsche, among many others. Freud's and Jung's psychoanalytic unconscious is certainly preceded by the irrational, natural unconscious of Schelling, the will of Schopenhauer, the will to power of Nietzsche. Jacques Rancière has further traced this unconscious to a shift from the regime of representation, which favored logos over pathos, to an aesthetic regime that reverses this priority. Particular to Jung's unconscious is perhaps the romantic belief in the unity of all nature, which translates for him to the healthy integration of multiple rational forces into the whole self. Elements of Schelling that inspired Jung include, according to Douglas, his, quote, impassioned philosophy of nature, his concept of the world's soul, which unifies spirit and nature, and his idea of the polarity of masculine and feminine attributions, as well as our fundamental bisexuality. The modern concept of self that Jung sought to break free from is that of the thinking subject. The ego is the seat of consciousness that defines the person and has privileged access to the objective world. In Jung's own words, it is only since the end of the 19th century that modern psychology, with its inductive methods, has discovered the foundation of consciousness and proved empirically the existence of a psyche outside consciousness. With this discovery, the position of the ego, till then absolute, became relativized. That is to say, though it retains its quality as the center of the field of consciousness, it is questionable whether it is the center of the personality. It is part of the personality, but not the whole of it. For Jung, the purpose of therapy is to reconcile the fragments of the self coming from the personal unconscious, collective unconscious, and conscious ego into an integrated whole that he called individuation. Following Jung's death, among his followers, the synthesizing function of the self took precedence over the function of de-integration, the breakdown of the ego in the face of the more encompassing psyche. In response to this classical school's more rigid thinking about the self, and some of Jung's concepts in general, as represented by, for instance, Marie-Louise von Franz, pluralistic Jungians such as James Hillman and Andrew Samuels emphasized multiplicity and a dynamic process where the self is not understood as an a priori there to be discovered, but is created through a plurality of reconciliation and inclusions of the other over time, as it is broken down and rebuilt through dialectic. The self is not a fixed entity, nor is the relation between the ego and the rest of the psyche ever a finished project. As analyst Warren Coleman put it, the wholeness of the personality is seen not in terms of integration leading to a state of unity, but in terms of inclusiveness, the development of the capacity to embrace multiplicity. Constructivist Jungians such as Louise Dinkin and Polly Young-Essendroth have also challenged this classical school's notion of an objective self that is discovered through the individuation process, a view held, for instance, by Erich Neumann. Dinkin and Young-Essendroth emphasize a sense of self that is acquired and is shaped through interaction with others in the environmental contexts. For some post-Jungians, the goal of therapy, or rather a therapeutic path through life, is not individuation or even the dialectic of the self. That doesn't mean that the breakdown of the self and reintegration through the surfacing of unconscious forces is not important to them. But development of the personality is either a stage on the way to, or a simultaneous process along with, the development of social and political consciousness. One approach to this is illustrated by the view of Lawrence L Schuler, namely that individuation as personal psychology supports the political psychology of what Brazilian philosopher of education Paulo Freire, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, called conscientization. L Schuler relates 3 stages of individuation: the separation of the ego from unconscious unity, the alienation of the ego from the self, and relativization of ego as more unconscious bits of the self are recognized and reintegrated, to the 3 stages of conscientization of politically and socially oppressed and marginalized peoples. 3 stages are magical consciousness, naive consciousness, and critical consciousness. At the 3rd stage, the oppressed become aware of their own internalization of the oppressor's ideology and the institutionalized injustice driving the personal injustices, working from a better demystified place to influence change. L Schuler sees individuation, along with the shedding of projections and recognition of the shadow that lurks in the ego alienation stage, as integral to larger societal transformations beyond the self. For further reading, some key works on the relation of Jungian concepts to political unconscious include Andrew Samuel's The Political Psyche, Michael Vanoy Adams' The Multicultural Imagination, Race, Color, and the Unconscious, and Fanny Brewster's African Americans in Jungian Psychology. So when dealing with Jung, one among the parade of elephants in the room is best bluntly stated by Susan Rowland. C.G. Jung was not a feminist, if by that we mean a straightforward supporter of gender equity. Nevertheless, he contributed to the psychology of strong importance and attention to the feminine as part of the psyche. Before counting this as a win, we need to look at how his problematic views of the archetypes of anima and animus are treated by post-Jungian and feminist Jungians. Defined briefly, animus and anima and animus are feminine and masculine archetypes that act as mediators between the unconscious and conscious personality, and are usually played out or discovered in the form of projections onto other people. These projections either reflect an ideal or a shadow, meaning an aspect of the self that is rejected or considered alien to the self. Jung claimed anima is an archetype experienced by or possessed by men and projected onto particular women, while animus is the counterpart archetype possessed by women and projected onto men. Jung's own basic androcentrism is guided his observations and examples used to support his theory of anima and animus, which reinforced gender stereotypes, particularly given his association of anima with feeling and eros and animus with cognition and reason, and worse, tied them to natal or biological gender. Jung's student Erich Neumann identified the concept of anima with other depictions of feminine energy in myths and tradition, all rolled into the theme of an undifferentiated primal great mother. For Neumann, anima is a princess and, quote, the abyss of the feminine in altered personal form. This princess is rescued from a devouring chaotic dragon, which is also the great mother, by the hero, which is the ego that comes into consciousness through militant differentiation from the feminine. The hero then arrives at his own feminine principle through relationship with the more passive, malleable princess. Peterson's own spin on myths and archetypes, as we just heard, in Maps of Meaning, arise out of this myth of myths. On the other side of analytical psychology, rather than reject the anima and animus archetypes wholesale, post-Jungians have altered understanding of them that they find useful in practice, particularly when detached from gender essentialism. James Hillman, for example, was critical of the gender dichotomy of animus and argued that everyone holds the qualities represented by both. This is actually in keeping with the ancient Greek beliefs about the soul that Jung studied, namely that masculine and feminine elements are present in each person in different measures. And we find this in various aspects of ancient thinking. This opposite of masculine and feminine becomes a metaphysical principle by the Pythagoreans, and then gets absorbed into ancient medicine, for instance, and the temperaments, ancient astrology, music theory, which is also kind of interesting there. I could talk about that for a long time, so that's just a little aside here. So Andrew Samuels, however, holds to the deconstruction of the masculine-feminine opposition, or rather, a suspended bracketing of this binary, and extracts from it the dynamics of difference, otherness, and division. He writes, "Animus and anima are ways of communicating otherness, difference, that which is momentarily unavailable because of unconsciousness. Animus and animus speak then of the unexpected, of that which is out of order, which offends the prevailing order." Samuel sees a parallel between the Lacanian phallus as the absolute signifier of difference and this post-Jungian queering of anima, animus, in which the phenomenon that is available to the analyst is not one of opposites, but where aspects of the self come to definition through difference and through images that reflect this fluidity within a structure of otherness. As a final note on this subject, Jung paid more attention to and attributed more positive associations to anima over animus, leaving research and interpretive gaps for post-Jungians to consider. One approach to animus is illustrated by the work of Jung, Essendroth, and Wiedemann that recognized the cultural influences on women leading to a sense of inferiority and used a model of psychotherapy for women that emphasized the animus complex to help overcome the internalization of culturally imposed gender roles. Delton Ann McNeely takes a similar approach in Animus Aeternus. Some analysts, such as Verena Kast, handle animus by collapsing the meanings of animus and anima into one archetype or complex that manifests in the images of both male and female authority figures, mysterious strangers, wise people, and unknown children. And notably, in the year 2000, Ellen Henke collected the views of analysts about animus, and her resulting statistical studies showed that characteristics associated with animus by the contemporary Jungian analysts differ significantly from Jung's gender-specific doctrine. These examples of the polymorphous, never-finishing self and the anima-animus archetype are but a small sample of how contemporary Jungian theorists and therapists adapted Jung to postmodernism, defined above as the seeking passage beyond modernity. I hope I've made it more clear that the traditionalist or fundamentalist Jungian school, often attached to biologism and essentialism, that of Peterson's Jung, is by now archaic in comparison. Post-Jungians have attempted to appropriate the best of Jung while leaving behind the empty caricatures, metanarratives, universalisms, and narrow interpretations of analytical psychology in order to give space for the more adaptable, sensitive, and sensible practices. That's it. Any questions?
So I was curious about, in our society, there's a lot of images flying around that are like archetypal. So I mean, you have the celebrity who gets caught up in their avatar, and they, often leads to suicide or violence, and it's this kind of like you can't navigate these images imposed on yourself. So I was wondering, with Peterson's audience, a lot of them look to these archetypes for a deeper well of meaning, but sometimes they end up being not even shallow, in the sense that they can't quite get the agency to like redefine themselves. So I was curious about, you talked a little bit about relation between self, ego, and psyche. What would you say about the skills for people to watch their archetypes, to like become responsible to them? What would you say about that?
Well, as I've mentioned at the beginning of the paper, this type of, if you want to do this type of analysis, I mean, it's going to cost you a lot of money to find a Jungian analyst. Therapy is absurdly expensive. And that's, what I advocate, obviously, is becoming self-educated and maybe find like some guidance, from, people that you respect in the field who, can, like, it's a life path. It's not, therapy is not just once and done,
Yeah.
So it's a matter of like self-educating and practicing. I personally, like, I'm not a great practitioner of any of these things. I'm certainly very interested in dream analysis. That's one of the things that really got me interested in this. So I do record my dreams and pay attention to them and like what kind of images are arising from these. But I don't have really good advice how to do this in practice, or even how followers of Peterson, could make that turn into like the more like appropriate version of post-Jungian analysis.
I'm very worried about the internet dream world. That's where they're getting their archetypes.
That's interesting.
If I remember my Joseph Campbell correctly, he remarks late in his life that if you politicize the mythos, you make a hash of both. And Jordan Peterson is, politicizing Jung's work, but using it for political purposes. This is a backhanded compliment to Jung. But how do you think our culture will be processing this now that the reactionaries have been making misuse of Carl Jung's work? I mean, how will this play out? Any ideas?
It doesn't. I'm not very optimistic. That's kind of why I'm here. Is at least spread the word that this is not what Jungians are actually practicing. This is not helpful therapy. So I don't. I'm just like this one little tiny voice, but.
Well, it becomes toxic very quickly. If you look at Gamergate, it had elements of the alt-right. Everything was there in utero. If you look at that through the Jungian perspective, you're just aghast. And it had taken over a political culture to a shame. It's catastrophic.
Yeah.
Maybe I've been in this room too long today, but I'm really excited by this sort of thread that came all the way from what Nathan was saying earlier. I wrote down an image of individuality to conform to, because that is essentially like that's what an archetype is, or like what a god is. It's like Marduk is like there to be like this is us, our identity as the Babylonian people, who winners, like we kill the so just like that image of individuality to conform to. We externalize it as a god, or we like find it in another person like Jordan Peterson as a hero, but like maybe like the last step and like what the goal of successful analysis is for that, to realize these categories are like don't contain all of the possibilities of the now, and that the individuation in a Jungian sense is about like that image of individuality no longer being externalized.
Well, what you see is a sort of like a collective transference.
Mm-hmm.
Peterson becoming, like the image, or the transference of the archetype, and like that's like Jungian psychology 101. And
if you're a young man and you're first introduced to archetypes, you're like a kid in a candy store. You don't know what you don't know.
But the thing, the wisdom of the underworld that Jung would say, or what all of that information that needs to be reintegrated is like, it's not something that you're going to get out of following a rule book. This guy. It's got to be this process.
Yeah, and I would say like the post-Jungian position is there is no rule book.
Yeah.
Yes, there are images, and these images are important. There is the unconscious. This is important. But it's very, like take dream analysis, for instance. There's no, you can't just, pick up one of those books from the New Age shop, like snakes mean this, wolves mean this, It's going to be, something that, if it has an emotional impact, for instance, on on you as the dreamer. Okay, that may be something to pay attention to, but that's very personalized. That's not like there aren't these rules set out in stone.
There's a weird, wild dream in Maps of Meaning. His own grandmother making a paintbrush out of her pubic hair and touching his face with it. I wonder what this is about. Yeah, it's in Maps of Meaning. Get the PDF and search for
I just have a question regarding how in Jungian analysis, the idea of the shadow as as the other as the self kind of thing, that there's this dialogue of the otherness of someone else is something that is also not represented in yourself, or that unacknowledged in yourself. I guess with post-Jungian interpretations, I think because of certain discussions about the concept of othering that have come out of feminist theory and so on, and post-colonial theory, there's, I think, a big dialogue about, do we just try and simply get rid of the idea that people can be other, or do we kind of internalize otherness to the point where everyone is other? Like, I guess, do post-Jungians see it as, we need to get rid of saying, that this person is other at all, or is it more of a, otherness doesn't come from a categorical stance, otherness comes from an interrelational, personal stance? If that makes any sense at all. Maybe I'm just...
You know what? I'm not sure. I think the person who's done the most work on this is probably Andrew Samuels, and he has several books that are drawing out the that link that I mentioned between Lacan and Jung in terms of the difference. These are points of difference rather than archetypes being fixed in stone. But yeah, I'm not educated enough to be able to answer that fully. But one thing I have noticed, when you mentioned the shadow, there still are classical Jungians around, and I have encountered some of them trying to interpret the political situation as, you're just projecting your shadow onto these political figures. I'm okay, that's wonderful, that's great, But you still find people trying to take the political situation and think of it in terms of the individual, think of it in terms of the person, rather than what some of the post-Jungians are doing, which is to broaden the see the self. Okay, an individuation. Okay, that's just one stage, and that's one stage along with social consciousness and political consciousness. So I know I didn't really answer your question very well.
So I don't know much about Jung, so if you can correct if I'm using the terminology wrong or something like that. But with talking about the transference, my understanding is the idea is just these people idolize Jung or Jordan Peterson. But is there a way to retain what's good in Jung and yet get them to focus on Jung and not Jordan Peterson or something like that?
Well,
is that inherent in Jung or psychoanalysis even?
I don't know. I think that's going to play out depending on Peterson's popularity in the future, and is this 15 minutes or is this going to be a long-term trend that we have to deal with? So everything that he's bringing with him, would still be an ongoing battle in a sense, for sensibility.
It's not something that we or society or something can actually cause. As far as okay, so
She's in the back of that room.
If there's an issue which is that they are focusing on Jordan Peterson and that is leading to something that's unhealthy, can we try to address some of the dysfunction there?
I'm not a YouTuber. I'm not somebody who goes out and posts in comment threads.
Yeah.
But anybody here who wants to do that, anytime these the Peterson worship or the Jungian concepts come up, please do.